it over to you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Zev, and we want to welcome everybody to as Zev mentioned, the second session of the Southeast Asian Focus series. As Zev mentioned, my name is Jeremy Haldeman. I'm the Director of Government Affairs and Advocacy at ALIGHT. We're an INGO, formerly known as the American Refugee Committee. And I think one of the things you'll hear about, which is why I'm so interested in this series, is that Southeast Asia, as everyone knows, has continued to grow in economic, strategic, and political importance over the years. My organization works throughout the region on both humanitarian assistance and development work. And so, as you all know, the U.S. has and will continue to make this region and its relationships a really high priority. And while the U.S. has fostered strong relationships with partners in the region, the past few years have certainly been tense. I think there's a really strong sense from folks in D.C. and elsewhere that this is a region that really should be prioritized once again. So it's also really timely. You guys are very fortunate to be able to hear from three really renowned experts in the region. And we're going to look at we're going to explore the impacts of the 2020 election and U.S. policy toward the relationships with Southeast Asia as a whole, and with also some specific nations as well. We're going to look at whether a new Biden administration will be more active, less active, what challenges are going to come out, and what kind of opportunities for growth in terms of cooperation over the security and economic realms could look like over the course of the next 4 years. So I'm going to give a quick introduction of our three panelists today, and then we're going to hear from them, and then we'll go into a question and answer session. As Zev mentioned, please do feel free to email him questions, pop them into the chat. We really want to make sure that these are as interactive as possible and you all are hearing the information that you want. So the first person you're going to hear from is Alina Noor. She is the Director of Political Security Affairs and the Deputy Director of the DC office at the Asia Society Policy Institute. She's a native of Malaysia, and she focuses her work on security developments in Southeast Asia, global governance and technology, and countering violent extremism. Prior to joining the Asia Society Policy Institute, she spent time as a professor at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Hawaii, and as a director of the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, which is a leading research institute in Malaysia. After Alina, you're going to hear from Prashanth Parameswaran, who's a fellow at the Wilson Center's Asia program. He also serves as a director at the Bauer Group Asia and is a senior columnist at The Diplomat. His research and analysis focuses on Southeast Asian political and security issues, Asian defense affairs, and U.S. foreign policy in the Asia Pacific region. And then finally, you're going to hear from Alexander Feldman. Alex is the chairman, president, and CEO of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. He's been involved in the ASEAN region for over 25 years in a career that spans both the public and the private sectors, and has lived in Asia for more than a decade. He's worked as an international media executive for CNBC Asia, Viacom, and others while he's lived abroad. He's also had a stellar career in public service, having held senior roles at the Departments of State and Commerce. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Alina.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you to the US Asia Institute for this opportunity. Let me offer some thoughts on today's topic along three lines of thought: expectations, constraints, and possibilities. Before I get into it though, perhaps a caveat is in order. Southeast Asia, as many of you from the region, I noticed from the participants on screen, and many of you familiar with the region will know, is extremely diverse and therefore extremely complex in many respects. This diversity is not only complicates regional decision-making, particularly when it comes to political and security matters, but also can be confusing to extra-regional partners like the United States that may view the country's differing positions as either mixed messaging or hopelessly paralyzing. There are, however, some common expectations of the incoming Biden administration and relations with the United States moving forward that I believe we can unpick. One of those expectations is that America will be back to the multilateral table. that it will show up as promised, and that it will once again be engaged in matters of pressing urgency for much of the world, notably pandemic recovery and climate change. In the Southeast Asian context, what all this will hopefully translate to is a return by the United States president to the annual ASEAN summitry after a 3 to 4 year long absence, depending on how you calculate appearances, because showing up at the right level goes beyond symbolism in the region. It is telling of interest, sincerity, and respect. To be fair, there have been a number of senior official visits to Southeast Asia under the Trump administration, even amid COVID-19, with a flurry of sorts happening since July when the US took a position on the South China Sea dispute. We know that Acting Secretary of Defense Chris Miller was in fact just in Indonesia last week. But these visits have been premised on China rather than on Southeast Asia per se. The expectation from a Biden administration is that the United States will engage Southeast Asia for Southeast Asia's sake, not because it is in a competition with China for friends and partners in the region, and certainly not because it wants to involve Southeast Asian countries in a Manichaean ideological struggle or standoff with China. In form, at least, the Biden administration signals a return to a more familiar conduct of foreign policy and diplomacy, one that's less erratic and less crass in form, but perhaps no less assertive on China. Within Southeast Asia, there are serious concerns, of course, about a muscular, even aggressive China. But the region has no interest in demonizing its neighbor simply because it's not in its interest to spark a conflict. You've heard the regional plea as voiced by Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, don't make us choose between the United States and China. If the Biden administration can seek to understand the priorities of Southeast Asian countries from the perspective of Southeast Asian countries themselves, without necessarily viewing every issue through a China filter, then perhaps interests between the United States and Southeast Asia can be better coordinated, if not aligned. By all indications, from the Democratic Party platform to Joe Biden's foreign affairs piece, from speeches to interviews, democracy will be the organizing principle of Biden's foreign policy. There are many enthusiasts of democracy across Southeast Asia, of course, particularly among civil society. So the US's return to a focus on democratic values will certainly be welcomed by some hoping for external pressure on their government. However, at the elite level in Southeast Asia, a public talking point on democracy will not be received as well, particularly with the US's own credibility issues at home, a point which President-elect Biden well understands. The United States may understandably believe that it has to center democracy in its engagement with Southeast Asia, indeed with the world, but if it can do so without the missionary zeal, without preaching or excoriating, then it may actually be able to better tune its messaging to the demand signals in the region. It doesn't do well to paint a simplistic binary vision of authoritarianism versus democracy in Southeast Asia, with its many forms of government, and in a region of mostly post-colonial nation states that have experienced subjugation under the guise of democratic ideals. Here's another reality check. Some have argued over the last 4 years, the United States changed, as did the rest of the world. I would argue that the factors underlying those changes were always latent. They just unfolded over the past few years more starkly and manifestly. One of those latent factors is Southeast Asian agency in shaping rather than merely participating in multilateral processes, a point that has always been too easy to ignore or dismiss. But it's evident with the conclusion of RCEP, the culmination of an 8-year-long slog of a process driven by ASEAN, not China. You saw it with the signing of the CPTPP. Maybe Alex will touch on these. And you saw it with countries like Singapore taking an early lead in contributing to the COVAX alliance, followed suit by Brunei and Malaysia. America's return to the multilateral fold will be welcomed, but there are now other players that have stepped in with a more active role. China, obviously, but also even smaller Southeast Asian countries, collectively through ASEAN, as well as individually. The question of interest for Southeast Asia is whether America under Biden will seek to reclaim leadership at all costs, or whether it would be willing to share that leadership role and position with others, notably China. The final constraint wrapped up in a few possibilities is this. Between COVID-19 and reviving the economy, the Biden team will have an extremely full plate in its first year. President-elect Biden has already promised to convene a summit of democracies in his first year. It would be nice if the US could invite ASEAN leaders to a special US-ASEAN summit the way Obama did at Sunnylands, or the way President Trump had planned on doing in Las Vegas. But it would be just fine if President Biden actually showed up to the ASEAN summits in 2021 and for the rest of his term, whether in person or virtually if we're still somehow confined to Brady Bunch boxes on our computer screens even then. It would also be great if a US ambassador to ASEAN could be confirmed as quickly as possible to fill the position that has been left vacant there for over the last 4 years. As my Thai friend, journalist Kavi Chongkitawon reminds us, the US was the first country to establish an ASEAN mission in 2011. Even though the US mission to ASEAN has still been active in its outreach and programming, the absence of an ambassador there for a whole presidential term certainly says a lot. You know, I was trained as a lawyer, so please forgive me if I end the way I started. And that's with a caveat. All this assumes that there won't be another black swan or gray rhino event that will overturn priorities, resources, and attention, whether in the United States or in Southeast Asia. I certainly hope not. 2020 has been trying enough, but the drama will not end on 1st January 2021. And we should also perhaps similarly temper our expectations for 21 January 2021. And on that cheerily upbeat note, thank you very much, and I look forward to a conversation after this.
Alina, thank you very much. That's a really great overview. Prashanth?
Great, thank you, and thanks to the US Asia Institute for the invitation. It's great to be here to share some thoughts, and I see a lot of participants in this, which is really encouraging. And also they have I see from the lineup here, some embassy colleagues, as well as some experts and academics on Southeast Asia. So I'm really looking forward to hopefully a good discussion after this. So as I suspected, you know, Alina set the table here pretty well, and I suspect not to preempt Alex's remarks, but I think we're going to find ourselves in a lot of violent agreement on some of the major points, at least, that we're touching on. I wanted to make just sort of 2 or 3 points to just broaden the discussion out a little bit. I think in terms of what Southeast Asia expects from the United States, I think we're looking at a series of 2 different administrations and where the region is going to look to a Biden administration in terms of continuity and change. I think in terms of the Obama administration, we saw by any account the greatest level of US engagement with Southeast Asia since the end of the Vietnam War. So we saw the intensification of strategic and comprehensive partnerships with individual Southeast Asian countries, including smaller countries, Laos, and so on and so forth, that often don't get a lot of high-level US attention. We saw a lot of attention and investment in diplomacy. We saw a lot of attention from high-level US officials. There were some constraints that the Obama administration faced with its Southeast Asia engagement in terms of, for example, its policy with China, the failure to get the Trans-Pacific Partnership off the ground. That was a lot of hopes in the region in that regard. But nonetheless, I think this conception of US attention to Southeast Asia being the so-called rebalance within the rebalance of the Obama administration still stuck, and I think is quite well-deserved and was appreciated in the region. In the Trump administration, we saw a ebb in US influence in the region, and you don't have to take my word for it. If you look at US perceptions of the United States engagement in the region, the Institute of Southeast Asian, ICES, Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, a think tank in Singapore, does their annual, well, now almost annual report on trends in the region. And they found that 77% of Southeast Asian elites thought that US engagement had declined in 2020 based on the poll that was conducted. So this is a perception of the United States that exists in the region. Obviously, this may diverge from reality, but in Southeast Asia, sometimes perceptions are reality, and optics do matter, I think, a lot more than some folks sometimes in Washington appreciate. There's been some continuity with respect to the Obama and Trump administrations, with respect to policy, with respect to the Mekong subregion, and development on the South China Sea. But I think in general, there has been an appreciation that there's been a kind of ebb under the Trump administration. So the question with respect to the Biden administration is, where are we going to land? I don't think there's any, at least from my conversation with Southeast Asian colleagues and what I hear from Southeast Asian policymakers, I don't think there's any naive sense that we're going back to the Obama administration. This is sort of an Obama 2.0. And I think there is an appreciation that this is not going to be a continuation of the Trump administration. I think the question is, where on that spectrum do we end up, right? And I think with respect to that, it is important to keep in mind, as we think about the United States and US policy in the region, Southeast Asia is not a region that is standing static. The region has been changing over the past few years. Now, more so than 4 or 5 years ago, China is seen as both the main security and economic player in the region. If you look at that poll that I mentioned earlier from ICES, the overwhelming majority of Southeast Asian elites now recognize that that China is not only the major economic player, it's also the major security and political player in the region. That might not necessarily be true, but perceptions do matter, and it suggests a changing narrative in the region with respect to how China is doing relative to the United States and other players. I think the other trend that's been really interesting over the past few years is that, as the United States, Alina mentioned this point, the United States under the Obama administration engaged a lot with Southeast Asia, but other powers also took a cue from that and also intensified their engagement with Southeast Asian counterparts as well. And so you've had Taiwan with its new southbound policy, South Korea with its new southern policy, India with its Act East policy. I mean, these are countries that not necessarily followed the United States, but US engagement and greater engagement with Southeast Asia has also intensified and have been occurring in this broader framework. So the game for the United States when the Biden administration enters into office is that the stakes have been raised. And so the United States will have to do a lot more relative to where the Obama administration was before the Trump administration's emergence. I also think there's a lot of intra-regional dynamics that warrant attention here. There's been a greater strain on democracy. The bad stories about democratization in the region that we've already seen, cases, for example, in Cambodia, where the opposition has endured a lot of resistance, those things have gotten even worse. Presumably good stories in the region in 2018, May 2018, when we had historic elections in Malaysia, where we thought there was going to be a sort of call for reform. That has been reversed to a certain extent over the past few years. And even countries where we used to talk about are sort of on the out front on democracy, like Indonesia, we're seeing a lot more concerns emerge on some of those counts as well. So I don't want to say that it's all bad with respect to democracy and good governance in Southeast Asia, but certainly the perception that you get in the region is that there's a lot of challenges, irrespective of what the United States or other outside players think. So where are we going to see continuity and where we're going to see change? I think continuity is a much easier question to answer. There, we're going to see a lot of the same themes and dynamics that we often see when a new administration enters into office. Where does Southeast Asia fit in this sort of struggle for attention amid domestic, regional, and global priorities? This is an administration, the Biden administration is going to be preoccupied with economic challenges, COVID-19, but there's also going to be pressure to reset things on climate change, on Iran, perhaps even on North Korea, normalize things with respect to China and this sort of dynamic of US-China competition that we're talking about. We're also going to see on the theme of US-China competition, not a sense of entire continuity with the Trump administration, but also I do think that US-China competition as a theme of US policy with the region is here to stay. I don't see that changing given where we are with respect to US policy and other actors in the US domestic political context. But that is something that we're definitely going to have to look at documents like the next National Defense Strategy that the Biden administration adopt and see where and how US-China competition is being framed relative to other threats and challenges with respect to Russia, Iran, North Korea, transnational challenges, et cetera. I think the question of change is harder to answer. I do think there are a few areas that are going to be interesting to watch. One is how the aperture is going to be broadened or narrowed with respect to security engagement and civil military relations. I do think, U.S. security engagement with Southeast Asia tends to stay fairly constant relative to the other pillars of engagement. But the key question is going to be, how is the United States going to leverage, and how is the Biden administration going to leverage some of these security tools for engagement with the region? Cambodia is an interesting case. We are talking about a context where, as I mentioned earlier, you have the Hun Sen government that's been cracking down on the opposition, but there's also an eye towards the future with respect to what a post-Hun Sen Cambodia is going to look like, and how the United States leverages some of its tools of engagement, including in the security realm, is going to be interesting to watch. The other one is going to be Myanmar. And after the elections that we just saw, as we move away from the sort of NLD dynamic with Aung San Suu Kyi and into the political future beyond that, how are we going to see the United States engage with not only the civilian government, but also the military and the security forces as well? That's going to be a major theme. It was under the Obama administration, and I suspect it will be under the Biden administration as well. I think the other brief point I'll mention on security is sort of a broadening of the non-traditional security lens. I suspect that we will see, on the basis of several issues, including climate change, with John Kerry as a sort of climate change czar, how will Southeast Asia factor into that? Some of the countries in Southeast Asia are some of the most disaster-prone countries in the world, including the Philippines. So this is a domestic concern for them, irrespective of what the United States think, but it also offers an opportunity for collaboration and cooperation in that regard as well. Couple of other points on the diplomatic front. I do agree with Alina that multilateral diplomacy is going to be front and center there. I think there's going to be a big opportunity for US-Philippine relations post-Duterte in 2022. We've seen a lot of headlines about continuity and change in the Duterte administration. I do think the consistency and the emphasis on the US-Philippine alliance that we've seen has been due to no shortage of hard diplomatic work on both sides. And I think that's going to be really interesting to watch with respect to an alliance perspective post-2022. But I also think you look at the rotating chairmanships of ASEAN, and you see Brunei having the chairmanship in 2021 and Cambodia in 2022. If you see high-level US attention in these two countries, we're going to see a test for how the United States engages not just with the big countries of Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, but also the smaller countries that often sometimes don't get a lot of attention. That's going to be really interesting to watch. I also think the United States, under the Obama administration, we saw the formation of the US-ASEAN Strategic Partnership back in 2015. Some of the cabinet officials in a Biden administration, including Tony Blinken, they have talked about ASEAN. Some of them have even spoken at US-ASEAN engagements, including at the US-ASEAN Business Council, as I'm sure Alex will sort of mention or touch on later. This is going to be really interesting to watch because the end of the first term of the Biden administration, not to preempt anything, is going to be the beginning of the run-up to the 10th anniversary of the US-ASEAN Strategic Partnership heading out to 2025. So that's going to be really interesting to see where the United States and ASEAN look to position themselves, including in terms of priority areas. Just two brief points I'll mention before concluding on people-to-people dynamics. One is, I do think we're going to see more sustained attention to democracy and governance. The Summit of Democracies that Alina mentioned is one important point, because the Biden administration thus far has positioned this as not only being about democracy, but also being about anti-corruption and transparency. And this is a huge issue in Southeast Asia and some of these Southeast Asian countries. We saw the multi-billion-dollar 1MDB scandal that rocked Malaysia, that had international and global headlines. And so how the United States looks to position Southeast Asia in that dynamic will be interesting to watch. I also think strengthening people-to-people ties and US soft power is something that maybe it's more of a hope from me rather than something that's actually going to happen. But I do think this is an important space to watch, right? So if you go to countries like Vietnam and Myanmar, what they remember, the people of Vietnam and Myanmar remember from the Obama administration is not some of these elite dynamics that we talked about, like the easing of arms sales to Vietnam, but rather, President Obama eating bun cha with the late Anthony Bourdain, or visiting a pagoda in Myanmar. I mean, these are things that really matter in terms of soft power and people-to-people ties. So how the Biden administration, depending on how diverse the cabinet is, what roles each individuals have, how they look to leverage people-to-people relations is going to be really important to emphasize. And of course, we're also talking about policy initiatives in this regard, the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative, which we hear a lot about, but I am continuously struck by the stories I hear about some people who are alumni in this program. I remember one individual sort of telling me that their experience with local government in the United States sort of taught them about budgeting and expenditures that they never had experienced in their home country in Southeast Asia. So I think these tools in terms of people-to-people ties and soft power, sometimes we really underestimate their value, but they really are very valuable in terms of building these links between the United States and Southeast Asian countries. So I'll end on that note with thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Prashanth. And I really liked how you kind of framed it between the continuity and the change pieces as well and kind of built it out from there. That was really, really great information. So Alex, I think we're really interested to hear from you, especially in the business perspective. And again, I'll just throw out a reminder to the group. If you have any questions, just send them over to Zeb as instructed in the chat. Alex?
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And thank you everyone for being with us today, especially my thanks go to the US Asia Institute and your leadership, not only today in bringing this group together, but also throughout your 41-year history. We're grateful, and as Prashanth said, there's not much daylight between what he said and what Elena said. I agree, and I could have said a lot of it myself, although they, of course, said it much better than I can. But I'm really grateful for their introducing the subject matter and their thoughts. They're two of the smartest people in Southeast Asia, certainly in the United States. So we're grateful for having them, and I'm honored to be on a panel with the two of them. A quick background on the USABC, or the US ASEAN Business Council. For those of you who don't know us, we were founded in 1984, making us coming up on 37 years of history in helping US business grow in Southeast Asia. We were founded to promote US business interests in Southeast Asia and promote opportunities in ASEAN within the United States. We're proud to be the only American organization that's officially recognized in the ASEAN Charter. And today we represent over 160 of the largest American investors and business partners with ASEAN through 9 offices, including 7 in Southeast Asia. As you heard, and as you all know, the Biden administration is coming in at an incredibly challenging time for the world and for the United States. And as you will expect, their first priority has to be the health of America and recovery from COVID-19, both from a healthcare perspective as well as an economic perspective. And that will take a lot of their attention, and will unfortunately mean that important issues like ASEAN will be relegated to a lower priority. Having said that, in my opinion, there's no higher priority outside of our borders than ASEAN. And the Biden administration is going to bring, as they've said through numerous channels, a very different approach than the one we've seen over the last 4 years, particularly in the way that they engage the world outside. They will bring a multinational approach. The president-elect has already said he's going to rejoin the Paris Accords. He's going to engage international institutions again, like the WHO. He's probably going to re-engage the WTO in a different way than we've been working with them in the last couple of years. And, you know, I believe that as part of this new way of thinking about the world, he will re-engage with ASEAN, and we hope, as you heard from my fellow panelists, that he will actually attend, if Brunei holds it in person, attend the ASEAN summit in November, and the East Asia Summit and the US ASEAN summits alongside it in person. And that would be a great step forward, and hopefully by November we will have a clear path to recovery, at least on the health perspectives, and allow him to leave the United States and join this important opportunity. We believe that at the USABC that he must continue to follow the Obama administration's legacy when it comes to ASEAN, especially when it comes to attendance of his administration at various ASEAN summits, including the ASEAN Regional Forum and the ASEAN Defense Ministers Plus, but also including the ASEAN Economic Ministers meeting, which traditionally the USTR has attended. Under President Trump, Ambassador Lighthizer did attend the very last ASEAN Economic Ministers meeting last fall, or this fall, but had not attended up until then. So we hope the USTR will come back, and that Ms. Tai will, if she's approved by the Senate, will attend in person if possible, or at least virtually, all of the ASEAN economic ministers meetings with the region. You heard from Alina that we should look at ASEAN for ASEAN's sake, and I totally agree with that. I'm going to address that in a minute. But you also heard from Prashanth that China is going to remain a factor, and I honestly believe that as well. It will be key to engagement going forward. It certainly will be key to getting attention in a lot of political realms, including the United States Congress going forward. And the links with China, to be fair, are strong. China and ASEAN share a long history, a culture, and a geography that you know, preempts the United States in some ways. It also, from a trade and economic point of view, ASEAN, China has long been ASEAN's #1 trade partner, but just this year, ASEAN overtook the EU and the United States to become China's #1 trade partner. I think that's just a very important factor that we have to consider going forward, that China itself is not going to disengage with ASEAN, and that China will continue to try and up its game in investment, in trade, in infrastructure, areas that I'll talk about a little bit later. But I would argue the US and ASEAN have a strong history as well. The US is a major reason for ASEAN's growth and development over the last several decades. We've heard about the security blanket that ASEAN receives from the United States presence in the Pacific, the freedom of navigation operations to keep the South China Sea open is an important factor. Obviously, the South China Sea is a critical factor going forward in US interests in the region, but also it's critically important for trade. And the US market has been a significant driver for ASEAN's goods and services as it develops and as it employs its own people. Against this backdrop, there is a universal consensus, as was reflected in the Department of Defense Indo-Pacific Strategy Report that Prashanth, I think, referred to earlier, which states as follows: the Indo-Pacific is the single most consequential region for America's future, period. And ASEAN is clearly the heart of the Indo-Pacific. Prashanth mentioned the US-ASEAN strategic partnership. That really is critical, and one of the key pillars of that partnership is economic ties and the growth of those economic ties. So I think the Biden administration would be wise to not wait until the end of their administration to address this, but actually to do what we should have done this year, but I don't think we did as well as we could have, and that is to do a midterm review of where that partnership lies and how the United States and the new administration can help us step up the game, if you will, and grow that partnership and ensure that when we do get to 2025, that we will have something to show for our partnership over the last 10 years. But I do agree with Alina that ASEAN matters on its own, and the United States has to focus on ASEAN for its own merits. And it's starkly apparent when you look at the economics that ASEAN offers. It's the third largest population in the world, 650 million consumers. It's the third largest workforce on the planet with an estimated 350 million laborers. It is a strategic heart, as I said, of the Indo-Pacific, and geographically it offers a great place for American business to serve the greater Indo-Pacific area. On its own, ASEAN is the 5th largest economy in the world with a combined GDP of almost $3 trillion in 2018. ASEAN is the #1 destination for US FDI in Asia for bar none. Americans over a history have invested $329 billion to date in ASEAN. And as you know, just because you invest 10 years ago in a factory in Vietnam, that factory is probably still going and probably updated since then. And we have a great stock of American investment in ASEAN. And as some of you have heard me say before, there's more US FDI in ASEAN than there is in India, China, Japan, and Korea combined. And that statistic always floors me, but that is true. That's from USTR. And it is, to say it one more time, there's more US investment, private sector investment in ASEAN than there is in India, China, Japan, and Korea combined. It is also the 4th largest, ASEAN is also the 4th largest destination market for American-made goods. Even being down 10% this year as we are in the first 3 quarters of the year, we still shipped over almost $60 billion worth of American goods to ASEAN. And ASEAN remains a top 5 destination for American agriculture. So these are all reasons from an economic point of view, and we haven't even touched on the digital economy, which I'll do later, why ASEAN matters and why the United States needs to look at ASEAN on its own merits. The Biden administration, as it looks to the future, needs to, I think, look at a couple of key areas for its growth, for America's positioning in the world. And the 2 main lenses that I want to look at for this conversation are trade and also infrastructure. First, we'll turn to trade. As has been said already, the U.S. is not part of CPTPP or TPP at the moment. Both of those agreements, many people don't know this, but both of those agreements are technically still live agreements, although CPTPP has been ratified in 7 countries, and those 7 countries include Canada, Australia, Japan, Mexico, New Zealand, Singapore, and Vietnam. And for those 7 countries, CPTPP is a working agreement and is in force at the moment, and that's a huge opportunity. Those markets are some of the biggest in the Pacific, and represent a huge opportunity for the countries involved. And by comparison, it also means that there is some challenges for American businesses trying to compete with companies from those 7 countries in at least the 7 countries where the agreement is live. You also heard that in November, the 15 countries that are part of the RCEP agreement signed that agreement, and will now be in the process of ratifying that agreement. Well, it is an ASEAN-led agreement. Many people have heard, at least in the United States, that it is China-led, but actually ASEAN is the instigator and the main proponent of RCEP. China is a part of it and makes it a big deal. But ASEAN and its +5 partners, unfortunately, India did not choose to follow through with its initial interest in RCEP, but hopefully someday it will. We'll create a free trade zone that encompasses 30% of the global GDP and almost 1/3 of the global population. And once again, unfortunately, the United States is not a part of that. You heard Prashanth talk about other players as well. One of them, I'm not sure I heard you say, but one of them from the United States point of view that's very important is the EU. The EU has really stepped up its game in Southeast Asia and has signed agreements, free trade agreements with Singapore and Vietnam, and those agreements are in force. It is negotiating agreement with Indonesia and has really challenged the American positioning in the economy of Southeast Asia and opened up Europe for trade in a more serious way. Currently, the U.S. has one free trade agreement bilaterally with Singapore that we've had in place since 2004. You may have heard President Trump talk about that as a great agreement. I think it is as well. It's one of the few agreements where we have a surplus with Singapore, and that has played very well in the current administration in Washington. But looking ahead, there are a number of opportunities for us. One is to enhance the current TIFA, or Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, that we have with ASEAN, and to see that go to a new level. And I think that should be an easy first look for the presumed new USTR, Ms. Tai. And we hope that we'll also look at how we can get back into TPP, but that's not realistic in the first couple of years of the Biden administration, given all the challenges of COVID-19, given a very challenging process with the United States Congress if we're trying to get back in and get that ratified and enforced. So while that should be an ultimate goal, I don't think that is a real goal going forward. The second area I wanted to cover briefly is infrastructure. You hear a lot of talk about it. China has certainly made this an issue through its Belt and Road Initiative. And China has said it's going to spend $110 billion, mostly in Southeast Asia, but in Asia overall, on the Belt and Road Initiative. I don't think the US should try and match China dollar for dollar in infrastructure. It's not really where our strength is as a business community. We like to sell components to infrastructure, like big components in many cases, like gas turbines for power plants. But we don't like to do turnkey solutions, which are really what the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, and others are very strong in doing. So on hard infrastructure, while I think energy is an exception, we probably should turn our sights elsewhere. And I think we do have real opportunities in what I'd call infrastructure writ large, including in ICT infrastructure, in healthcare. We heard about vaccine diplomacy, and human capital development. Prashanth again touched on that, but from a business point of view, we've got a lot of opportunity to position ASEAN and to give back in ways that have significant opportunities and positioning for the United States, but do not have substantial costs in dollar terms for these programs. So I think we can do a good job, but we've got to look not to take China on head on and look to where America's strengths are. The third area that I want to touch on before I conclude is the digital economy. And I think this provides an amazing platform for the United States. It certainly plays to our strengths. Certainly China is a much bigger player than it was in this space even 5 years ago, but the US still has the competitive advantage. And the ASEAN digital economy offers tremendous opportunity. And we've seen with COVID-19 how the adoption of digital products and the digital services has accelerated. But just out about a month ago, actually not even a month ago, less than a month ago, the Google Temasek and Bain study projected that the ASEAN digital economy will exceed a net worth of $300 billion by 2025. And I think if anything, that's an understatement, but we will see. $300 billion is a big enough target to get people's attention, I hope. E-commerce through COVID-19 has surged, and internet usage in ASEAN is growing at a blistering pace of 10% a year, with 40 million new users this year alone, bringing the total internet population in Southeast Asia to 400 million people. And when you also remember, one of the things I didn't talk about ASEAN, and Prashanth talked on it again, is the youth population of the region. It's one of the youngest regions in the world. There's over 380 million people under the age of 35 in ASEAN, and that means that ASEAN is connected, they're tech savvy, and they're ready for digital products. Therefore, I think one of the proposals that I'm going to give to the the Biden administration is to think seriously about digital economy agreements, digital trade agreements. These can be modeled after what we've done with the US-Japan digital trade agreement, or the digital chapter in the USMCA, Mexico-Canada agreement. It can also be looked at from a lens in Singapore, where Singapore has done digital economy agreements with Australia, New Zealand, and Chile so far, and is in conversation with many others in the Asia-Pacific region. I believe that our very first step out of the gate for the Biden USTR team should be to look very seriously at how we can execute a digital economy agreement with Singapore to help set the rules of the road for this digital economy in the future. Remember, it's worth $300 billion. It does not appear that it needs to be ratified by Congress. The US-Japan digital trade agreement was not. With Singapore, we could also use a model of just updating the US-Singapore free trade agreement by updating the telecoms chapter in that agreement. And again, that should not require congressional ratification, although I know the Biden administration will be smart and will consult with Congress along the way so that there is congressional support for this kind of approach. I think once you have agreement with Singapore, you can then develop a model agreement, which you can then offer to other like-minded TPP countries. Vietnam and Malaysia come to mind, as does Australia. Remember that the United States spent 7 years negotiating the digital chapters of TPP with these same countries. So I would think that both with Singapore and the other 4 countries I mentioned, that this would be a quick process where maybe 90% of the agreement is already done before the parties get to the negotiating table. And hopefully we can then expand that to countries that were TPP aspirants and maybe CPTPP aspirants, and that would include Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand. So with that, I'm going to stop there because I really want to hear your questions. I hope I gave you an overview of the economic landscape. There's so much more to talk about. Certainly, we didn't go into any of the countries specifically. Happy to do that in Q&A. Jeremy, thank you. I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, Alex, that was a great overview. That kind of the economic view of the region from here. So that's actually really terrific. Thank you. Yeah, so people keep sending in your questions. We've gotten quite a few, so I'm going to jump right in. Actually, all 3 of you, touched upon the re-engagement on the multilateral front in different areas. And one of the questions that we actually got is about, do we think the Biden administration will be placing a higher priority on human rights and democracy in the region? And I'm curious if you all can talk about that, and the question is really like, how are they going to do it? Will it be bilateral discussions? Will it be back in the multilateral fora, both on the diplomatic front, but then also how will that be addressed in any kind of future potential trade agreements? Alina, do you want to take the first crack?
Sure, I think we already have a good indication based on statements and speeches and declarations that democracy and human rights values will be front and center of the Biden foreign policy. I think though that, as I mentioned in my remarks, the US will get a lot further in advancing this message to its Southeast Asian counterparts if it does this quietly rather than publicly, and in a nuanced fashion rather than through ideologuing. And I'm confident that with the professionalism and experience of the incoming Biden team, that this is well understood. I don't think there'll be this zeal and impassioned haranguing of Southeast Asian governments about democracy and human rights. Although I think for the US domestic consumption, this will be a pointed topic that the Biden administration will want to emphasize, although in its interactions with the region, I think it will be a lot quieter, at least I hope.
Prashanth, you want to jump in? Anything?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I agree with what Alina said, and I think part of it is just going to be how not only the United States balances its interests and ideals, which has kind of been a tension for US policy for decades, but also finding creative ways to do that, to be able to talk about these issues in a way that acknowledges US limitations and challenges as well, and makes it more conversational. So I'm struck by, one example I kind of bring up in the context of, Black Lives Matter and what's been going on in the United States. And, some of these Southeast Asian countries have their own issues with respect to identity, is the former US ambassador to Singapore, Kirk Wagger, did a really interesting sort of engagement at Yale NUS in Singapore, where he talked about, he addressed issues with respect to race and identity and some of these issues that Singapore experienced, but he didn't talk at all about Singapore. He talked about the US challenges with addressing African Americans and civil rights in the United States. And the questions that came out from the students were actually about, hey, how do we leverage some of your examples and the lessons you've learned for our domestic context? And I thought, these are the kind of interesting conversations that ultimately lend itself to more of a sort of dialogue, rather than sort of lecturing and sort of the feedback that you get thereafter, which is, kind of predictable. We've been through these multiple rounds of feedback over time, dating back decades.
Yeah, I think on just jumping on the trade side, obviously President Biden's going to bring President-elect Biden is going to bring a different perspective. He already is. His USTR review team, looking at how the agency gets set up and its priorities, includes, as you would expect, representatives from industry and academics, but also includes leading law professionals, and labor leaders, and political coalition builders. And I think that indicates, especially his pick of Catherine Tai to be his nominee for USTR, indicates that he will prioritize some of the labor and environmental issues in any agreements that he might pursue going forward. Again, major agreements around the world will be challenging with the Congress and with his challenges with regards to COVID-19. But I think that when you do see agreements, and hopefully you can see early ones in ASEAN, they will address these issues. This is the role that Catherine Tai played in the House Ways and Means Committee. So we expect that they will play in, although maybe not exactly as human rights issues per se, but through the lens of labor.
Right, that's great, thank you. We got a couple of questions actually about the signing of RCEP, and Alex, I know that you actually touched a bit on it in your speech or in your notes, but can you go, do you have a little bit, we have a couple of questions kind of specifically, what does it mean for the US policy, or generally, but also kind of specifically about the relationship with China that you all also touched on as well.
Sure, I'll try and do this. I know Prashanth and Alina could come in as well, but look, RCEP or RCEP is a great agreement. We take our hats off to ASEAN for leading it and to Asia for addressing it at a very challenging time in global trade. And so I think it means that global trade is alive and well in Asia. I think it's a wake-up call for the United States. But from an American business point of view, I think it's positive. We believe that anything that brings down barriers is positive. As you said, we have $329 billion invested in Southeast Asia. And as long as we're providing adequate local content when we manufacture or continue the manufacturing process in Southeast Asia, we will qualify for RCEP benefits, and therefore American products that are made, at least in part, in Southeast Asia will be a beneficiary of RCEP. So we think it's a very good step forward, especially at this time of COVID, where trade is really challenged and a lot of the world is looking inward. But obviously it is a wake-up call for the United States, because we want to produce in the United States as well. and production from coming out of the United States will be disadvantaged going into RCEP countries once RCEP is ratified. I will notice that I will make reference to the fact that it is just signed and not ratified, so it's not enforced yet. But on the flip side, CPTPP in 7 very important countries for the United States is enforced, and we are seeing that disadvantage for American-made goods in the United States, which is a priority of our companies as well.
That's great. Alina or Prashanth, do you have anything to add on? Okay, great. Thank you for that. We actually also got a couple of questions related to climate change, which of course came up in several of the remarks that you all made as well. And I'm curious, can you all give, the questions are really centering around, what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, related to it, but very clearly, right, that the Biden administration is coming in with a almost diametrically opposite view that the Trump administration does on it. What do we think about, what we've seen out of the gate already from the transition in terms of the Biden administration's focus on it, and what are the business and economic opportunities as well in the region? Alina?
Yeah, I think there's a real opportunity for the US to showcase its commitment to climate change issues, sustainable development issues. And this is taking into account the strategic competition from a US lens with China. By championing these issues to BRI countries in Southeast Asia. I understand that there have been some offers of energy projects based mainly on coal mining. And I think the US could come in here with alternatives, sustainable alternatives to BRI countries as a way to diversify the energy options for many of these countries.
Prashanth?
I did.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead, Prashanth, please.
Oh yeah, no, I just make 2 points. I agree with what Alina said about the energy context. Just 2 brief points. I mean, one is, the climate change issue is, a big issue for Southeast Asians, irrespective of what the United States does or thinks, right? So I mentioned earlier this poll from ICES, and obviously polls have their limitations, totally understand. But the question was, what are the top 3 security issues that you see in the region? The first one was, I think, domestic political issues. The second one was economic issues. And the third one was climate change. So the first 2 came in at about 70+%. Climate change came in at 66.8%. So this is not something that the United States is just advancing, and some of these Southeast Asian countries don't actually care about this. This is something that matters for them. I think the second thing that I would mention with respect to climate change that has gotten a lot of headlines, but I do think it is something that should be emphasized, is that the United States under the Obama administration took a keen interest in the Mekong subregion in mainland Southeast Asia. And the Mekong is one of the longest, largest rivers in the world. And this was something that was recognized with respect to the challenges with excessive building of dams and hydropower related developments in the subregion. The United States came in with the Lower Mekong Initiative, and thereafter, several other countries have gotten very interested in this issue, including China, which has come in with its own initiative in the Mekong. And so, there's been continued investment in the Trump administration on some counts, but there has been a sense, I think, in some mainland Southeast Asian countries that the United States could do more and could focus a little bit more on this challenge. And I think that's going to be one which is going to be interesting to watch in the region in the next few years.
Thanks, and I'll just jump in on the business side. Obviously, there are tremendous opportunities for clean energy in Southeast Asia. Companies like GE have a wind turbine factory in Vietnam, and certainly are big players in wind across Southeast Asia, powering a number of potential opportunities in that regard. Exxon just today announced that they're going to make a big move. And I'm going to read a quote for you, but Exxon plans to reduce the intensity of our operated upstream greenhouse gas emissions by 15 to 20% by 2025 compared to 2016 levels. And this will be supported by a 40 to 50% decrease in methane intensity and a 35 to 45% decrease in flaring intensity across our global operations, including big refineries in Singapore and elsewhere. So that part I added, but the other part was a direct quote from Exxon's press release today. So our companies are moving in this direction very rapidly, whether they're in the pure clean energy space, or whether they're moving in that way in a big way and from other perspectives. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for American business in the environmental realm, and we'll certainly at the U.S. ASEAN Business Council be projecting that. We've got a brand new sustainability committee that we're standing up in 2021, and already is going to be the largest committee that we have in the council. So that gives you an idea of how our companies see the opportunities in the environment and clean energy.
That's great, thanks. You know, Alina, you actually said at the very top of the discussion, you know, that you said the region is both diverse and complex. It has some commonalities, but obviously very different individual country priorities. So in that vein, I think we're going to turn to a couple of very kind of specific country-specific questions. These are obviously, we're going to throw them out obviously to all three of the panelists, but I thought your frame was perfect for the transition to some country-specific questions that we have. The first one is related to the Philippines. You know, strong military ally in the region, but it's obviously the relationship has deteriorated over the past couple of years. So I think the question to all three of you and kind of the different lanes that you're talking about, you know, do we think the Biden administration will prioritize rebuilding the relationship? What are the challenges? What do you all see as the future with the U.S.-Philippine relationship?
You're not listening.
I guess I'll jump in here, and I'm sure my colleagues will jump in because they actually are just as wise as I am, if not more. But look, I hope the Biden administration prioritizes the relationship with the Philippines. It is one of the strongest people-to-people relationships that we have anywhere in the world. And there's a huge Philippine American population in the United States that drives that relationship. But it makes tremendous sense. And certainly on the trade front, there have been discussions on a U.S.-Philippine free trade agreement over the course of the last 4 years. We had hoped that they would get further than they have. They haven't really gotten too far out of the gate yet. But we'd hope that among the different trade options that the Biden administration has in the medium to long term, we'd hope that they'd start to lay the groundwork, if not negotiate that free trade agreement. Again, passing a free trade agreement in the current Congress in the next couple of years, given everything else, is probably a long shot. But certainly starting these negotiations, which can take quite some time, makes some sense. So I hope that will be one avenue to move forward on. And I'll leave it to Elena and Prashanth. Take it from there.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I certainly hope that the Biden administration, even as it prioritizes some of these newer partnerships, still focuses on traditional allies, so the true treaty allies for the United States and Southeast Asia, Thailand, and the Philippines. You know, I think the Philippines has and still continues to be, you know, a key indicator not only of U.S. presence in the region, but just more generally, if you're looking to see what the U.S. military presence is in the Asia Pacific, one of the key points you look to is the Philippines, right? And that is something that U.S. policymakers have looked to develop not just bilaterally, but also in terms of regional relationships with bringing in countries like Australia and Japan. So that perspective is going to be really important to maintain in that regard. One thing I would say about the U.S.-Philippine alliance, though, I think there is a perception in some of the countries. The Philippines is one, Singapore is another one, which is not an ally, but a very strong partner, that the United States, as it's building some of these newer partnerships and it's focused on big priorities like China, is, you know, sort of quote unquote, sometimes taking for granted some of its traditional allies and partners. So I think on some of these traditional partnerships, you know, arguably more attention is needed rather than less in order to restore credibility. And like I said, if there is any uncertainty with respect to the U.S.-Philippine alliance that's been brought about by the Duterte administration, we're going to get into a context in the Philippines where in 2021, they're going to be focusing towards more the 2022 context for the U.S., for the Philippine elections that are coming up in 2022. And we're going to be moving beyond the sort of rhetoric about Duterte that sometimes grabs the headlines. I also do want to emphasize, though, that one of the interesting things, the US-Philippine alliance has been stress tested over the past few years, but I think it is an indicator of the resilience of the alliance that we've had diplomatic practitioners on both sides that have been able to keep the relationship afloat in spite of all of that. And I think it is testament to the strengthening of the alliance and the record that it's built over the past few decades.
Yeah, I just add maybe a minor point. So I agree violently with both Prashanth and Alex. But I would just add kind of that Prashanth mentioned the people-to-people ties. In the Philippines, polling shows that the Filipino population is very, very strongly in favor of engagement with the US, continued US engagement, despite what goes on at the political level. And I think it would be remiss of the US to overlook this simply because it favors kind of those big strategic issues, competition with China, and reaching out to some of the newer, more exciting partners like Indonesia and Vietnam. Also in the Philippines, I think it's important to remember that there are some on-the-ground priorities that still continue to plague security priorities of the Filipino security apparatus. And this includes the rebuilding of Marawi, as well as some of the non-traditional security challenges posed by some of the rebel groups in the Philippines. So I hope that while the US continues to focus on some of these big picture issues, it doesn't forget that there are on-the-ground priorities that it needs to coordinate with its allies on, and in this case, the Philippines, particularly with what's going on the ground and in the jungles.
That's great, thank you. So we're gonna take just kind of one more question before we close here. And if it's okay, we're just gonna do a super broad question to close out, and would love to hear from each of the three panelists. What do you think the top priority for the Biden administration should be kind of moving forward? I know you all touched on it, but if you have a super quick top line, if you were to advise them, what should it be?
I'd just jump in here, Jeremy. I was speaking to I promised to do it off the record, so I'll just name him as a foreign minister of a member of ASEAN recently, and he reminded me that in Asia, not just in ASEAN, but in Asia, trade is strategy. And so if I was going to advise the Biden administration, I would say make sure that we get back on the table in some significant way, although it doesn't have to be a huge way, in trade. And that signal that we are back in the trade game will be very important in Asia for everything else, the security, the human rights, the environment. All of those conversations will be empowered by us taking a leadership role again in the economics of the Indo-Pacific and of ASEAN. And I would suggest that the path would be a digital economy agreement with Singapore as the very first step. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Prashanth?
Yeah, I'm gonna steal Alina's top line point, which is, building out a policy that puts Southeast Asia for its own sake at the center. I think it's not only important to acknowledge that as a reality because of all the statistics that Alex mentioned, but to my mind, the longer term challenge for the United States is building a stronger domestic political constituency for why Southeast Asia matters for US interests, not just for US policymakers, but just Americans more generally. And I think the more awareness we can promote in that regard that's sustainable, the better.
And I made my pitch in my initial set of remarks. Just show up. I think the absence of the US over the last 4 years has been very, very telling of how the US feels about Southeast Asia. And so it's a low bar right now. Just show up, even if it's virtually on screen.
That's great. Thank you, Alex, Alina, Prashanth, very much for sharing your kind of thoughts and expertise. It was really interesting.